We looked at the school of the dining room table and we laughed. We saw the chaotic scenes of toddlers running around while older siblings half heartedly filled out worksheets, and we dismissed it as quaint, backward, or just a little bit disorganized. We treated it like a sitcom quirk. But we were looking at it all wrong. What if the chaos wasn't a lack of discipline, but a precise, calculated strategy? What if the lack of education wasn't a bug in the Duggar system, but its primary feature? We are investigating the dark theory that the Duggars deliberately crippled their children's education to ensure they would never have the skills, the confidence, or the credentials to leave the compound. We are calling this the intellectual embargo. This wasn't just homeschooling, it was the systematic construction of an unemployable underclass, designed to create a permanent captive audience for Jim Bob's control. We are peeling back the layers of the Advanced Training Institute curriculum to reveal a horrifying reality. They weren't raising leaders. They were raising hostages who didn't even know they were locked in. If you are ready to look past the reality TV edit and expose the dark machinery behind the curtain, you need to hit that like button right now. It helps us get this information out to more people who have been misled by the wholesome facade. And make sure you are subscribed to the channel with notifications on. We are digging into reports and theories that the network never wanted you to hear, and you do not want to miss what we are uncovering next. The foundational lie of the Duggar Empire was always, our kids get a superior education. Jim Bob and Michelle stood in front of cameras for years, claiming that their method wasn't just a religious choice, but an academic upgrade. They sold the world on the idea of the school of the dining room table as a hub of moral and intellectual excellence. But when you actually strip away the polished talking points and look at the materials they used, a chilling picture emerges. This was not education. It was revisionist history and anti-science rhetoric packaged as wisdom booklets. This brings us to the Advanced Training Institute, or ATI. To the public, it was just a Christian homeschooling curriculum. To experts who have since analyzed the text, it was a method of indoctrination that prioritized obedience over literacy. We have received unconfirmed insider reports, whispers from those who moved in similar circles, suggesting that the educational neglect was even more active than we thought. There is a theory circulating that there was an unspoken ceiling on how much the children were allowed to learn. The theory suggests that once a child reached a level of competency that might allow them to question the patriarch or, God forbid, apply for a secular job, the resources were pulled back. The focus shifted entirely from algebra and biology to character qualities. This is the intellectual embargo in action. If you don't give a child the tools to understand the world remains a scary, decipherable place that they are too terrified to enter. Let's look at the wisdom booklets themselves. These weren't textbooks. They were pamphlets that attempted to route every single subject, math, science, law, medicine, back to a specific interpretation of Scripture. Now, there is nothing wrong with religious instruction, but ATI replaced actual facts with verifiable falsehoods. We are talking about a curriculum that reportedly taught that men have one fewer rib than women to this day, a biological fallacy that can be disproven with a simple X-ray. When your science education is based on literal interpretations that ignore centuries of medical advancement, you aren't being educated, you're being blinded. New information suggests that this wasn't just about shielding them from evolution. It was about severing their connection to reality. If a child believes the outside world is lying to them about basic anatomy, they will believe the outside world is lying to them about everything else. That is the genius of the embargo. You don't have to build a physical wall if you build a mental one. By teaching the children that secular education was not just different, but actively evil and factually incorrect, Jim Bob ensured that his children would view a state university not as an opportunity, but as a gateway to hell. But let's talk about the victim who illustrates this tragedy most clearly. We need to talk about Joy-Anna. For years, viewers watched Joy-Anna grow up on screen, often labeled as the tomboy of the family. But looking back at the footage now, with the lens of the intellectual embargo theory, her story is heart-wrenching. There is a specific sequence that haunts many observers, footage of Joy-Anna as a teenager, struggling with basic math concepts that most children master in elementary school. At the time, the show played it for laughs. It was a relatable moment of homeschooling struggles. But was it, or was it documentation of educational neglect? We have heard rumors, exclusive theories from sources close to the fundamentalist community, that Joy-Anna was actually identified early on as having a different learning style, perhaps one that required more attention or specialized tutoring. Instead of getting her help, the theory goes that she was simply told to pray harder and focus on her servant's heart. This is the crux of the unemployable child strategy. A bright young woman whose potential was systematically suffocated. When you see her struggling to multiply or divide, you aren't seeing a lack of intelligence, you are seeing a lack of investment. You are witnessing a bright spark being smothered because a woman who can do math might one day calculate that her unpaid labor is worth more than she is getting. The tragedy of Joy-Anna is the tragedy of all the Duggar daughters, but she wore the confusion so openly. She was being groomed for submission, and in that world, submission doesn't require calculus. It requires compliance. The curriculum was designed to make them feel small. If you cannot understand the basic mechanics of the world around you, you become dependent on the one person who claims to have all the answers. In this case, that person was Jim Bob. By denying her a standard education, they ensured that her only career option was mother and wife. There was no plan B, there was no secret scholarship fund, there was just the dining room table and the mandate to obey. This leads us to the smoking gun of the intellectual embargo, the GED results, or rather, the complete absence of them. In a family of 19 children, statistically, you would expect a variety of academic paths. You would expect some to excel, some to struggle, some to pursue trade schools, some to go to Ivy Leagues, and some to go to community college. But in the Duggar household, the academic output is a flat line. We need to investigate the ratio of Duggar children who hold accredited, state-recognized high school diplomas versus those who simply graduated by their mother's standards. The gap is staggering. There are unverified leaks surfacing now that suggest the graduation ceremonies we saw on TV were purely for show. The theory is that the diplomas handed out were not legally binding documents in the way we understand them, but internal certificates of completion for the ATI program. If this is true, it means that legally, many of these adult children may not possess the basic credentials required to get a shift manager job at a fast food restaurant. Think about the power dynamic that creates. If you are 25 years old, but on paper you have the qualifications of a middle schooler, you cannot leave. You cannot simply pack a bag and go because the economy has no place for you. You are unemployable by design. The insider reports go even darker. There is speculation that Jim Bob actively discouraged the pursuit of the GED because he knew it was the first step toward independence. A GED is a key. It opens doors to trade schools, to community colleges, to the military. By keeping the bar for graduation entirely internal, based on character and Bible memorization rather than standardized testing, he hid the key. The children were told they were elite, that they were ahead of their peers, when in reality, they were being left behind in a race they didn't even know was happening. We also need to re-examine the role of Michelle in this embargo. The school of the dining room table was her domain. While Jim Bob was the architect, she was the enforcer. But was she also a victim of the same system? Remember, she implemented the ATI curriculum, but she didn't write it. She was following the instructions of a patriarchal system that told her that her children's souls were more important than their minds. However, the result is the same. We have seen footage of the older girls tasked with teaching the younger ones. This is the buddy system applied to academics. But if the teacher doesn't understand the material, the student has no chance. It is a degradation of knowledge like a photocopy of a photocopy, getting blurrier with each passing sibling. By the time you get to the younger batch of kids, the education has been diluted down to almost nothing. There is a disturbing theory gaining traction that the focus on jurisdictions, the chores and household management tasks, was intentionally ramped up as the children hit puberty to distract them from their lack of academic progress. If you are exhausted from raising your siblings and scrubbing floors from dawn until dusk, you don't have the energy to wonder why you don't know who the vice president is or how a bill becomes a law. Exhaustion is a tool of control. The intellectual embargo relied on keeping them busy with practical service so they wouldn't notice they were being intellectually starved. And what about the boys? You might think the sons would be spared this embargo because they are expected to be providers. But the strategy applies to them just as ruthlessly, only the outcome is different. The boys were not educated to enter the workforce. They were educated to enter the Duggar workforce. They were taught construction, car flipping, and real estate, but only within the parameters of Jim Bob's business. They were not given the certifications or the degrees to take those skills elsewhere. They learned to work for him, not for themselves. We have heard unconfirmed whispers about a contract of sorts, not a written legal document, but a verbal covenant made with the sons. The deal was allegedly this: you don't need college, you don't need debt. I will give you a house and a business to run, but you must stay under the umbrella. It's a golden handcuff. A son who is a master carpenter but has no license, no business credit history of his own, and no knowledge of how to navigate the secular permitting world is just as trapped as the daughter who doesn't know math. He can only work on Duggar sites. He can only sell Duggar cars. The intellectual embargo ensured that even the providers were providing solely at the pleasure of the patriarch. Let's go back to that fake news angle, or rather, the theories that the mainstream media is too afraid to touch. There is chatter on forums from people claiming to be former ATI members who say that the Wisdom Booklets contained explicit instructions on how to answer questions from truant officers or social workers. If this is true, it implies a level of deception that goes beyond religious freedom and crosses into obstruction. It suggests they knew that what they were doing wouldn't pass muster with the state, so they rehearsed the lies. They weren't just failing to teach, they were teaching their children how to hide the failure. This brings us to the most insidious part of the strategy, the illusion of choice. The children were likely told they could go to college if they wanted to, but they were simultaneously fed a steady diet of horror stories about what happens at universities. They were told that professors would ridicule their faith, that they would be corrupted by liberal agendas, that they would lose their souls. So when a Duggar child says, "I chose not to go to college," is that a free choice? Or is it the result of a lifelong fear campaign? This is the success of the intellectual embargo. You don't have to forbid them from leaving if you make them terrified of what lies beyond the gate. We are watching a real-time experiment in what happens when you remove a human being's access to the collective knowledge of humanity. The Duggars didn't just homeschool, they world-proofed their kids. And now, as adults, we see the cracks forming. We see the awkward social interactions, the inability to articulate complex emotions, the reliance on platitudes. This isn't just social awkwardness. It is the symptom of a mind that was denied the nutrients it needed to grow. As we move deeper into this investigation, we are going to look at the business trips. You saw them on the show as mission trips to Central America. You saw the tears, the prayers, the handing out of food. But we are going to recontextualize these trips completely. What if I told you that these weren't humanitarian missions at all, but the only form of career counseling these kids ever got? We have a theory that these trips were designed to traumatize the children into gratitude for their captivity. By dragging them to the most impoverished places on earth, Jim Bob was sending a clear message. This is what the world looks like without me. It was fear-mongering disguised as charity. Prepare yourself, because in the next part of this report, we are going to expose the reality of those trips, and we are going to tackle the college is for liberals doctrine that kept the boys in line. We are also going to discuss the legal threat that could bring the whole house of cards crashing down. You think you know the story, but the intellectual embargo goes deeper than you can imagine. We promise to expose the truth about the mission trips, and this is where the intellectual embargo strategy turns from neglect to active psychological warfare. To the casual viewer of 19 Kids and Counting, those trips to Central America were the emotional high points of the season. We saw the Duggars packing bags, we saw the tearful goodbyes, and we saw them landing in destitute villages to hand out rice and Bibles. The narrative was always the same. The Duggars are giving back. They are the benevolent helpers. But we are recontextualizing these trips not as humanitarian aid, but as the only form of career counseling these children ever received. And it was a counseling session designed to terrify them. We have developed a theory, supported by unconfirmed insider analysis, that these trips served a dual purpose that had nothing to do with charity. First, it was about the white savior complex, reinforcing their own sense of superiority. But more importantly, it was a scared straight program for the Duggar children. Think about it. These kids were sheltered from everything. They didn't know what a nightclub looked like. They didn't know what a public high school looked like. They barely knew what a movie theater looked like. The only glimpse of the outside world Jim Bob allowed them to see was extreme, abject poverty in developing nations. By bypassing the functional secular society of the United States and taking them straight to third world disaster zones, Jim Bob was crafting a very specific worldview. He was showing them a binary reality. You either live in the safety and abundance of the Duggar compound, protected by your father and his rules, or you live in the dangerous, starving chaos of the world. There was no middle ground presented. They weren't shown successful secular families, or happy atheists, or thriving communities that didn't follow the IBLP teachings. They were shown suffering. The message drilled into their heads was clear. Look at this misery. This is what happens when you don't have our protection. This is what the world looks like without us. We have heard whispers from sources familiar with the family's travel dynamics that the children were discouraged from learning the local trades or understanding the actual economic political reasons for the poverty they witnessed. Instead, the focus was entirely on spiritual warfare. They weren't there to build sustainable infrastructure, they were there to hand out tracts. This reinforces the unemployable child strategy. If they had gone there to actually learn how to build wells or install solar panels alongside local experts, they might have gained a transferable skill. They might have realized that people outside their cult had knowledge worth learning. But by framing the trip solely as evangelism, Jim Bob ensured they remained intellectually isolated even while thousands of miles from home. They came back with no new skills, only new fears. And this fear is the glue that holds the embargo together. But what happens when a child gets too old for fear to work alone? You need to cut off their escape routes. This brings us to the ultimate betrayal. The college is for liberals doctrine. This is the mechanism used specifically to cripple the sons. While the daughters were raised to be wives, the sons were technically raised to be leaders. But here lies the paradox. Jim Bob couldn't afford for them to be actual leaders because a leader thinks for himself. He needed them to be middle management in his own empire. For years, the public line was that the Duggars avoided college to avoid debt. Buy used and save the difference, right? They claimed that student loans were a trap. But we are dismantling this lie today. The Duggars are millionaires. Between the TLC paychecks, the real estate portfolio, and the speaking fees, they could have easily afforded state university tuition for every single one of those kids without borrowing a dime. Money was never the obstacle. The obstacle was the campus itself. We are investigating the theory that Jim Bob actively sabotaged his son's educational ambitions because a university campus is the one place where the intellectual embargo cannot survive. In a college classroom, you are forced to debate. You are forced to cite sources that aren't the Bible. You are exposed to women who are in positions of authority, professors, deans, experts, which directly contradicts the ATI worldview that women should be silent. If a Duggar son went to a real university, he would learn that the history he was taught was revisionist, that the science he was taught was pseudoscience, and that the sociology he was taught was basically cult propaganda. He would come home a stranger, he would come home a threat. Look at the case of Joseph Duggar. There are reports, and this is crucial, that Joseph actually attempted to go to college. He enrolled at Crown College of the Bible. Now, this is a very conservative religious institution, hardly a bastion of liberal thought. But even that was apparently too much. He didn't stay. He returned to the fold almost immediately. We have an exclusive theory that Joseph was pulled back or encouraged to drop out because even a conservative college environment began to loosen the screws of Jim Bob's control. The business of the dining room table required his labor more than his mind required expansion. Instead of degrees, the sons were given business. But let's look closer at these businesses. We see them flipping cars, flipping houses, working construction. To the casual observer, they look like entrepreneurs. But are they? Or are they day laborers for their father? An insider theory suggests that none of the sons truly own their success. The capital comes from Jim Bob. The permits are likely navigated through Jim Bob's connections. The real estate licenses are held under the family umbrella. This is the genius of the trap. He didn't just fail to educate them, he replaced education with a dependency loop. If one of the boys wanted to leave today, let's say Jason or James wanted to break free, what is their resume? Worked for dad. In the real world, without accredited certification, without a verifiable employment history outside the family trust, they are unhireable in any high-paying corporate sector. They are trapped in the blue-collar sector, which is honorable work, but without their own capital, they are stuck swinging hammers for someone else. Jim Bob ensured that the only person with the capital to hire them was him. He created a closed economy where he is the central bank, the CEO, and the human resources department, and the only requirement for employment is total submission. This brings us to the legal threat, a ticking time bomb that we believe is keeping the family patriarch awake at night. We are talking about educational neglect. For decades, the homeschooling movement in Arkansas and across the U.S. operated with very little oversight. It was a wild west where parents could claim they were teaching their kids, and the state just took their word for it. But times are changing. With the recent documentary exposures and the tightening of homeschool regulations in several states, we are exploring a groundbreaking question. Could the Duggar Academy face retroactive legal scrutiny? We are looking at the potential for a massive class action lawsuit, not from the state, but from the children themselves. Think about the legal definition of neglect. It involves the failure to provide for a child's basic needs. We argue that in the 21st century, education is a basic need. Literacy, scientific literacy, and critical thinking are survival skills. By championing the ATI curriculum, which we've established is riddled with factual errors and historical revisionism, did Jim Bob and Michelle commit educational fraud? We have unconfirmed reports that legal experts are quietly looking into the possibility that the diplomas issued by Michelle Duggar could be considered fraudulent if they were used to obtain anything of value, like grants or entry into certain programs, though they mostly avoided this by avoiding the systems entirely. However, the bigger threat is the right to education. If a Duggar child leaves the cult and realizes they were deliberately kept at a 5th grade math level to prevent them from functioning in society, do they have grounds to sue for damages? Imagine a lawsuit where Joy-Anna or one of the Lost Boys sues the estate for loss of future earnings. The argument would be simple. My parents deliberately withheld standard education to ensure I could not earn a living wage independently, thereby forcing me into indentured servitude within the family business. This isn't just a family dispute, it's a labor trafficking theory. The intellectual embargo wasn't just bad parenting. It was a business strategy to secure cheap, loyal labor for decades. We also need to look at the Jinger and Jill factor. These two are the cracks in the dam. Jill specifically has made the radical move of enrolling her children in public school. We need to analyze this not just as a lifestyle choice, but as an admission of guilt. Jill is effectively saying, I cannot teach them because I was not taught. By outsourcing her children's education to the state, she is confirming the failure of the dining room table. She is breaking the cycle of the intellectual embargo. She knows that if she tries to homeschool them the way she was homeschooled, she will cripple them just like she was crippled. This is the silent scream of the survivor. And what about the grandchildren? There are unverified rumors that some of the son's wives, women who came from slightly more educated backgrounds, are secretly horrified by the literacy levels of their husbands. There is a theory that a friction is building within the marriages, where the wives are realizing they are married to men who were systematically stunted. If these wives decide to prioritize their own children's education, it creates a direct conflict with Jim Bob. The grandfather wants another generation of uneducated followers. The mothers want children who can function. This is the new battleground. We are actively investigating the current status of the younger Duggar girls, Jordan, Josie, Jennifer. Are they still using the Wisdom Booklets, or has the scrutiny forced a change? Sources suggest that since the show was canceled, the performance of schooling has stopped, and the neglect might have actually worsened. With no cameras to perform for, is there any school happening at all? Or have they fully transitioned into being full-time caregivers for the expanding brood of grandchildren? The intellectual embargo creates a terrifying feedback loop. You starve the child of knowledge so they cannot leave. They stay and have children. They cannot teach their children because they know nothing. The second generation is even less educated than the first. It is a spiral into total ignorance, and it serves only one master, the man at the top of the pyramid. In the final part of this expose, we are going to look at the overlooked protagonist in more detail and bring everything together with the smoking gun. We're going to talk about the psychological toll of realizing you have been dumbed down on purpose. And we will deliver the final call to action that frames this not just as a YouTube video, but as a movement to demand accountability. You are watching the dismantling of a dynasty, one failed math test at a time. Do not go anywhere. We have explored the curriculum and the coercion, but now we must confront the wreckage. The true horror of the intellectual embargo isn't just found in a failed math test or a missing diploma. It is found in the psychological architecture of the adult Duggar children. We are witnessing the long-term effects of a strategy designed to induce a state of permanent imposter syndrome. Imagine reaching adulthood and realizing that you lack the basic general knowledge that society takes for reference. You don't know the history of your own country beyond a providential revision. You don't understand the basics of biology. You can't participate in a conversation about current events because you were taught that the news is a lie. This creates a deep internalized shame. We have a theory, supported by behavioral analysis of the recent vlogs, that this shame is the final wall of the prison. Even if the physical gates of the compound are open, the children are too embarrassed to walk through them. They feel less than. They feel stupid. And when you feel stupid, you cling to the one place where you are told you are smart: home. Jim Bob didn't just hide the keys to the world. He convinced his children that they weren't capable of driving the car. This becomes painfully obvious when we look at the in-law paradox. This is a crucial piece of the puzzle that exposes the hypocrisy of the entire system. Look at the men Jim Bob allowed his daughters to marry. Derek Dillard, law school graduate, accountant. Jeremy Volo, college graduate, former pro athlete. Ben Seawald, college graduate. Why did Jim Bob approve these matches? We believe he thought his money and influence could buy their submission. He thought he could bring these educated men under his umbrella and control them just like he controls his uneducated sons. But the plan backfired, and this is the smoking gun that proves education is the antidote to Duggar control. Who were the first ones to break away? Who were the first ones to publicly challenge Jim Bob? The educated in-laws. Derek Dillard didn't just leave. He used his legal education to expose the fraud. He understood contracts. He understood labor laws. He possessed the very tools Jim Bob had worked so hard to keep away from his own sons. This proves our theory. The intellectual embargo was necessary for Jim Bob's survival. As soon as you introduce critical thinking and legal literacy into the family, the pyramid scheme collapses. Contrast Derek and Jeremy with the Duggar sons, Jedediah, Jeremiah, Joseph. These young men are arguably just as charismatic and capable by nature, but they have been educationally neutered. They cannot challenge their father because they rely on him for their livelihood. They don't have the degree to fall back on. They don't have the license to practice law. They only have the skills to work in the family business. The in-laws are the control group in this experiment, proving that the lack of education in the Duggar lineage was a deliberate choice to ensure obedience. We also need to address the modern evolution of the unemployable child, the influencer trap. You might look at Jessa or Joy-Anna and say, but they have jobs. They are YouTubers. They make money. But let's look closer. Is this true independence, or is it just a digital extension of the dining room table? We argue that steering the daughters towards social media influence is the modern version of the embargo. Being a mommy vlogger requires no accredited education. It requires no interaction with a secular HR department. It keeps the woman in the home focused on domestic tasks while monetizing her privacy. It fits perfectly into the ATI model. They have simply traded the TV cameras for iPhone cameras. They are still selling their personal lives because they were never given the skills to sell anything else. It is a precarious, fragile existence. If YouTube shuts down tomorrow, or if the algorithm changes, what is the backup plan? There isn't one. The intellectual embargo ensures that they are always one platform change away from financial ruin, which forces them to stay in the good graces of the family trust. There are unconfirmed insider whispers that this reality is starting to dawn on the Lost Boys, the middle batch of sons. The rumor is that there is a growing resentment towards the parents, not just for the religious trauma, but for the economic sabotage. These young men are realizing that they were raised to be princes of a kingdom that is crumbling, and they have no skills to survive in the village outside the castle walls. We are seeing a shift in their eyes in recent photos. A look of realization and quiet panic. They are starting to understand that Wisdom Booklets don't pay the mortgage when the show is canceled. The GED gap we mentioned earlier is the final nail in the coffin. We are calling on investigators to demand the release of anonymized educational data for the district where the Duggars reside. If we could prove that the Duggar children statistically drag down the average for homeschoolers in their region, it would be the objective proof needed to push for legislative change. This isn't just about one family anymore. It's about a loophole in the law that allows ideologues to erase a child's future before it even begins. We must also consider the science textbooks. We have obtained descriptions of the materials used in the Duggar home, and they are shocking. These books frame environmentalism as a pagan religion. They describe mathematics not as a universal language, but as a way to calculate the dimensions of Noah's Ark. When you teach a child that X equals a Bible verse rather than a variable, you aren't teaching math, you are teaching theology. This left the Duggar children functionally illiterate in the language of logic. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a generation of adults who are waking up from a long-induced coma. Some, like Jill, are fighting their way out, painfully relearning how the world works, enduring the humiliation of realizing what they were not taught. Others are digging in deeper, terrified to look over the edge of the flat earth they were raised on. The intellectual embargo was a success for Jim Bob Duggar. He built a workforce of cheap labor and a congregation of guaranteed believers. But for the children, it was a tragedy. They were robbed of their curiosity. They were robbed of their potential. They were constructed to be unemployable so that they would never have the means to walk away. We are watching the slow-motion collapse of this strategy. The internet, the in-laws, and the inevitable curiosity of the human spirit are eroding the walls. But we cannot let them rewrite history. We cannot let them pretend they provided a superior education. We have the receipts, we have the theories, and now we see the truth. This investigation is far from over. As more NDAs expire and more tell-all books are written, we expect to see the actual scanned pages of these textbooks surface. And when they do, we will be here to analyze every single line. They weren't homeschooled, they were institutionally stalled. Click subscribe if you want to see the actual science textbooks that taught the men have one fewer rib than women. We are going to expose it all.